Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about Casablanca. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And this week, we'll be here, not for the whole time, but you're going to see here in a little bit us at live at the cinema. We got to do a live episode after Casablanca. We had Will Scheibel there, and so you'll get to see that. I actually didn't think I could save the video, but I found some random thing that it's not great, but it's acceptable, I think. And the audio is great, so you'll get to see that here in a little bit. But okay, so what you're going to see next is Jason, me, and Will Scheibel sitting on stage at the cinema. So here's the deal. It's cut a little strangely, and here's what happened. We were sitting there at Casablanca. The film just ended. We got up on stage. We're really excited. You know, maybe a handful of people stayed. Not the full cinema crowd, but you know, enough people that we were excited to do it. And as we're sitting there talking, John had offered us the option before we started. Do you want to have questions from the audience? And we were like, nobody's going to want to talk to us. Nobody's going to want to say anything about this. You know, we'll just do our thing, and then we'll be done, and then we'll get out of here. About 10 minutes in, a guy just like throws out a comment from the audience. And I was a little taken aback at first. I was kind of like up in arms, like, hey, this is our thing. Stop messing with us. But it turned out, you know, people started to get into it, and it was very enjoyable. Here's the problem. We were on mics that were feeding into my recorder. He was not.
Right.
I looked desperately for audio on all sorts of channels to try to find the sound of people talking. I couldn't find it. So I had to cut all the audience comments. So what you'll see is like us talking out to the whole crowd, and then you'll see us sort of like, and then it'll cut. So that's what happened. So sorry to those of you. We'll be better prepared next time. Speaking of next time, November, sorry, let me get the exact date. It is November 3rd at 6:30.
I was going to say 4th. I was close.
November 3rd at 6:30. We're doing it again.
Yeah.
Doing it again. We're going to introduce From Here to Eternity, and then we're also going to do a live episode after that. We're going to have Craig Simpson from The Lily, who's going to join us. So that's actually a great day for movies. It's The Third Man at 3, From Here to Eternity at 6:30, us at, you know, whatever time From Here to Eternity ends, maybe 8:30.
Well, sometime in eternity, I'm sure.
Yes. It'll be From Here to Eternity, so we'll be somewhere in there. But that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So keep an eye on that. Get your tickets now. $3 for the ticket. You're not paying for us. We don't get a cut yet.
Yeah, podcast is free.
Yeah. So that's the next thing you'll see. Us on stage at the cinema. Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're live at the cinema. All right. Thank you guys very much. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And with us this week to talk about Casablanca is Will Scheibel, a CMCL grad student and a classic Hollywood scholar.
Hello.
So how about that? Casablanca on the big screen. Yes. So I want to start with, you know, every time I watch a movie here for the first time, I see things I didn't see before. So that's what I want to start with. I'm sure you guys had a similar reaction. For me, I had never noticed how specific Bogart's introduction is. He has like a serious. It's almost a whole bit. It's like 5 minutes of going to see him, and you see his arm, and he's playing chess against himself. I think is that what he's doing. And what I found interesting about that is that Bogart wasn't like a huge star at the time. He wasn't like he was known, but he wasn't like the big hero. Right. So I don't know how Curtiz decided that was the thing to do. That would make sense if he was like a huge star, but for that I don't know.
Well, the original choice was Ronald Reagan, so just imagine that with Reagan instead of Bogart.
Yeah.
But Bogart was actually, up until the early 40s, most known for his roles not as wartime romantic heroes, but he was known as known for playing gangsters and criminals. Yes. Petrified Forest, High Sierra, Dead End. So this was Not the first, but one of the first films that cemented his star persona as the cynical but at heart sentimental romantic hero that would extend throughout the 40s.
Yeah. So do you know, was the anti-hero like a big thing at the time? It feels like almost this was like the first big anti-hero, but I'm sure it must have occurred before now.
I think arguably the anti-hero existed before this film and you know, before this image of the anti-hero as played by Bogart. He was in Maltese Falcon playing, I think, more of an overt anti-hero. And in the 50s, after he became famous for playing these, you know, romantic wartime male protagonists in movies like Casablanca, he would play tough guy psychopaths. So that's a much more explicit Bogart anti-hero than you ever get in something like Casablanca. I'm thinking of In a Lonely Place, the Nicholas Ray film, or Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which was just screened here recently, where that is Bogart in full-on anti-hero mode. But I think, you know, there were probably examples earlier than that. You know, James Cagney in The Public Enemy is more of an anti-hero. I think Bogart is more heroic in this film than anti-heroic.
Yeah. So what did you guys notice that you never noticed before?
Well, one thing I noticed was you were talking about sort of the introduction of Bogart's character. One thing I noticed was everybody's little meetings together. Like, oh, this is, you know, you go to this boat, you be here at this time.
Yeah.
I never noticed that until, I mean, I was front row, so it was just right there in front of me. That was just one thing that I noticed, and then just sort of how that changed throughout the entire movie.
Yeah. Yeah,
how it got just very specific. So, you know, you have all these plans, and then there's really only one plan. That was one thing that I noticed, just sort of that string through the whole movie.
Yeah.
I love the introduction to all the little, you know, kind of character actors and so forth, too. But for me, the thing, I've seen this movie many, many times, so there wasn't a lot that I hadn't noticed before. But for me, seeing it on the big screen, what stood out to me is a very, very brief moment. And if you blink, you're likely to miss it. And it's right after the flashback sequence when we come back with Rick in the bar. And all of a sudden, the door opens and you see Ilsa. And she looks like a ghost. It reminds me of a scene in Out of the Past. And I don't know how many people have seen that film when Robert Mitchum sees Jane Greer walking in kind of in this kind of spectral image. And there's kind of mist behind Bergman, and she's in white. And it's
the
really,
searchlight hits her just as she opens the door.
And it's really eerie. I guess that was the sort of cinephiliac detail that jumped out and pricked me more than anything else in the film.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the history of the film, let's talk about that, because you're also very into noir, Will. There's a lot of noir influence in this film, and I don't know if a lot of people think about it that way, but you know, Curtiz has always been, you know, a guy who really loves shadows. Anyways, there's this great scene in Adventures of Robin Hood where the two guys are sword fighting and they come out of frame, and then there's this 30-foot tall version of them on a pillar in the background. It's just their shadow.
Right.
You don't see them at all, and they come back into frame. There was a lot of that in this film as well, but maybe you could talk about some of the noir aspects.
Well, Michael Curtiz was actually not known as a noir director. He was best known for directing Warner Brothers swashbucklers like The Adventures of Robin Hood, Captain Blood, The Seahawk. And I was thinking you were probably going to ask me about Casablanca's relationship to noir, and I was afraid of that because everyone always asks me that, and I don't know that I would consider Casablanca a noir, but there's probably an argument that could be made for it. It definitely has some of the noir archetypes, with Bogart playing this kind of cynical, weary character, and the, you know, shadowy lighting that you've identified. But to me, it seems too romantic and too invested in patriotism to be comfortably labeled a noir for me, because to me, love does not conquer all in film noir, and noir is all about kind of questioning things like nation and government and authority. It's not a kind of propaganda vehicle like this film was. Yeah.
So let's talk about the history of the film a little bit. I imagine that since this is a classic film, that everyone who worked on it knew it was going to be a classic film, and everyone was very happy to be working on it and liked everyone that they worked on with it.
You would think so, but that was not the case. I mean, this was a 1942 film. It was produced during World War II. And as I said, it's an example of anti-fascist propaganda. It's really asking the question, is American isolationism a practical policy anymore? Mm-hmm. And it was released just after the Allied invasion of North Africa, so it was very much a product of its time. But you know, it was really just another Warner Brothers romantic melodrama, and that's how it was packaged. It wasn't this kind of movie where people were making it saying, okay, this is going to be, you know, one of the great American films we have on our hands. It was really just sort of churned out of Warner Brothers during the heyday of the studio system, like many other romantic melodramas at that time. Yeah. And so its popularity grew over time.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I did see a sort of a duality that I didn't really realize, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I want to keep talking about sort of the production of the film and how it all came together.
So as I said, it was Michael Curtiz, who is a veteran of Warner Brothers swashbucklers. A lot of other important people were associated with this film beyond just Bogart. It was written by Julius and Philip Epstein, and as well as Howard Koch. And it was based on an unproduced stage play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. Max Steiner did the music and popularized as time goes by. That song was in existence before the film, but it became much more popular because of its, prominence in the film. And like I said, it was just something that was churned out of the Warner Brothers studios at the height of the studio system, and it was, you know, seen as just a good, solid movie made for entertainment. It won 3 Academy Awards. It was well received, but it wasn't, you know, instantly canonized at that moment. That you know, its canonical status would be enshrined later. It won Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Director for Curtiz, and I think, you know, we can talk maybe a little bit later about why it's become so popular. I think part of that has to do with Bogart, and part of that has to do with the formula that it did not invent, but it did. Like I said, in addition to cementing Bogart's star persona, it cemented a certain kind of formula as well. Yeah.
So, well, let's just go into that. Why is this movie so popular? Why is it so satisfying? I mean, let's talk about a specific scene, because I have a counterexample for this particular scene. On Tuesday night, we played Grand Illusion here at the cinema. Grand Illusion has a scene that is almost exactly the same as a scene in this film, where all of a sudden they start a spontaneous rendition of La Marseillaise.
Right, yeah.
Now, in Grand Illusion, they're all in a prison camp, okay? So the stakes, I feel like, are so much higher in Grand Illusion, where...
Just a little bit.
Yeah, where these guys have guns pointed at them at that moment, and they still fly in the face of their German captors and say, now we're going to sing our national anthem to your face to show you up, because, you know, there was just some great French victory that they heard about. This scene in Casablanca, though, I find so much more satisfying, and I guess I'm not sure why.
I think maybe it's because Rick gives permission to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, without his sort of like, oh, yeah, let him do it, it would have never happened.
That's true.
So I made that connection, that Rick was allowing it to happen, thus maybe sort of looking into the future a little bit about, you know, his sympathy towards the cause.
Right. Yeah. It's when he starts to stand for something. I love that little nod that Bogart gives.
Well, let's keep going on that theme. What else about this film do you feel like just makes it so satisfying?
I think part of it is, as you both nicely demonstrated, it's endlessly quotable.
Yes.
Even though Bogart does not actually say, "Play it again, Sam."
That's true.
That's true.
Most misquoted line probably in all of cinema.
Exactly. I don't know. Maybe people would disagree with me on this. I typically teach this film when I teach Intro to Media Studies, and I talk about its historical significance in relationship to classical Hollywood, but I don't talk about it as this really original, unique film. This is better than any other romantic film. It's unlike any other romance movie you will see, any other wartime film you will see. The argument that I pose to my students whenever I teach Casablanca is it's actually the quintessential example of classical Hollywood. It's not original, it's not unique, it actually just demonstrates or epitomizes what American cinema does and what it does best. And there are all sorts of examples of this. You can think of it just in very, very formal terms in terms of its continuity editing, its suture effect through things like shot, reverse shot, for example, the way it sutures us into the narrative and stitches us in there almost surgically to identify with Bogart's character. You can think about it ideologically, where we're identifying with this white male hero, and he is our goal-oriented protagonist. It's a narrative driven by linear cause and effect action that moves us through to narrative closure, where he does the right thing. He stands up for the cause. And so in the end, it leaves us with entertainment as the bottom line. This is what Hollywood always does. It is giving you a product for the masses, and that's exactly what this is. It's not an art film. It's not an avant-garde film. It's a love story. It's a melodrama.
Yeah. I mentioned this in our episode a couple weeks ago when we were talking about this. Even though I think a lot of people have claimed, and probably rightly so, that this is the greatest Hollywood film of all time, it has one of the most un-Hollywood endings, I would think. Now, he does do what we would consider the right thing, but he doesn't get the girl.
Sure.
He sacrifices. So does that play into it, do you feel like?
I think so, because since the film tells us that's the right thing to do, in its own way, it's a happy ending. Maybe it's a bittersweet ending. That's the better way to say it. But no, he doesn't get the girl. But he stands up for the cause. It ends on an incredibly patriotic note. It's very much like a lot of the wartime productions of that period of Hollywood film, and it asks us to sympathize with Bogart. It's not like the end of The Searchers, for example, where John Wayne is destined to wander between the winds, and he's this character who's really kind of gone to the edge. Bogart here has actually redeemed because he realizes that, as Sidney Greenstreet says at the beginning, isolationism is not the most practical policy.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another thing. I never picked up on this for the longest time because I didn't know the history that well, but now I know the history a little bit better, so I did. That very last thing that Claude Rains does with the water, Vichy water. Vichy France was the government that he was, a member of, that was sort of collaborating or at least cooperating with the Nazis. And he looks at it and he drops it in the trash
and then
can.
Kicks it. Yeah.
And he does. I never understood that until I understood the history. So that's another just one of those little things. But yeah, again, so satisfying. Jason, anything you want to?
I mean, obviously, you were talking about the Hollywood system. Is it my right assumption that they pretty much just had somebody in a small room writing this? Like they just said, we found this great story, write this movie.
It's interesting because when the Epstein brothers were writing the script, the ending was not decided until much later. They didn't know how it was going to end. They didn't know if Bogart was going to get the girl or not. And there are a couple lines in the movie where somebody will say something like, well, we don't know the ending yet, or we don't know how this story is going to end. And I see that as a very sort of self-reflexive moment, and I don't know if that's intentional or not. But it wasn't until, into the production, almost at the last minute, when they decided this is how we're going to end it.
Yeah, and I was watching my Blu-ray this last week, and I watched the special features, and apparently Bogart basically said he wasn't going to do it at some point, like he wasn't going to read the speech.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, maybe, I would have to go back and watch it to get a good sense of it. But
Ever the cynic, ever the anti-hero to the end.
Exactly. One of the things, let's talk about Curtiz a little bit more. Did you guys notice how much the camera moved in this film? Like, it was, I don't think he ever came to set on a day without the camera on a dolly or on roll, something. He was ready to move that camera in almost every single scene.
And they push into those great star close-ups and kind of medium shots. And there are several with Bogart that I think are particularly iconic that, again, cement that image for him in the 1940s, moving him from the gangster that we saw in Petrified Forest to not only the character Rick in Casablanca, but this formula would be repeated again in movies like To Have and Have Not, where he was paired with Lauren Bacall, who became his wife.
Peter Bogdanovich says To Have and To Have Not is better than Casablanca.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but it is a very good movie.
It's a great movie. Howard Hawks directed
and very
that film.
similar.
Very similar.
Yeah.
Another movie called Action in the North Atlantic is very similar, kind of in the Casablanca mold, with Humphrey Bogart playing a similar character. And what we could say is sort of a unofficial sequel to Casablanca, Passage to Marseille, also directed by Curtiz, also produced by Hal Wallace, who did this film, and starring some of the same people in Casablanca. I mean, he's not playing; they're not the same characters coming back, but it's that same formula that just gets repeated again and again. And I think you get some of those moments where the camera literally kind of pushes us into these characters. That's what helps them kind of live in our memories. I also am always surprised how much the camera is moving. It's not like Touch of Evil. It's not like Orson Welles with these long takes, but it is moving a little more than I think we're used to seeing at this time, especially compared to To Have and Have Not.
Especially in something like a romantic comedy,
right?
Not a romantic comedy, a romantic drama.
Dramedy, yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, well, and you spoke of the iconic shots. Obviously, the one where he just comes rushing in and is like, "I told you never to play that song again."
Right.
It's right there. But one thing I did notice when she's first hearing that song, how long that shot is. So obviously the camera is moving a lot, but I also noticed how much the camera just stays on people's faces for such a long time, and not only the women in the film, but also the men, like Bogart, for instance. That was just something that I've never picked up on, and that's just something I always seem to catch. Just the technical sides of things when it's here on a big screen. I mean, obviously, you can have a huge TV at home, but it just doesn't do it like it does here. But that's just what I noticed, was especially just the emotion in Bogart's face. I don't know if I ever actually picked up on that. Just the I can't remember exactly which scene it was. What he just breaks down a little bit.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it happened. It happened like 30 minutes ago. I don't know.
Well,
Right.
I know. It must have been horrible days at the office when close-ups on Ingrid Bergman. Curtis didn't know what to do. He's like, I've got this actress, I got to keep the camera on, what am I going to do?
Well, one thing I noticed about these close-ups is the water in the eyes. I mean, people are always kind of tearing up in this movie anyway, but this is the first time I'd ever seen it on the big screen, and I never noticed how almost every close-up of Bergman, she's about ready to start crying.
And that's what there's one just of Bogart that I never noticed that there's tears in his eyes. I just always thought that, obviously he's very upset.
Right.
But that was the first time I noticed the actual detail of it. And of course, the restoration helps.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I watched the
She's got a different
exactly.
Well, that guy was given a really good deal.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Yeah. Well, I did see. I was listening to one of the commentaries on the. And by the way, if you don't have the Casablanca DVD, they've reissued it several times, but it's a really great DVD. There's two commentaries on it. One from Roger Ebert before he lost his voice, and one from a guy named Rudy Belmer. And basically what he does is he has just production notes, like memos that went back and forth between different people. And that was one of the things they brought up. And what they basically said was she shouldn't have evening wear. It's like she shouldn't have evening wear. She should just be in like normal street clothes. But that was their compromise, I guess. But yeah, I agree. She does have quite a bit of clothes for someone who's running from the Nazis.
Well, and that also makes it very, very quintessentially Hollywood. Beautiful people doing beautiful things, even on the backdrop of these horrible events, as you all have noted.
Yeah, we were talking about the lighting. They use practical lighting only when they want to, it seems like.
Right.
That's what I really
when it
notice.
Works. Yeah.
When it works, we go with it.
When it's dark in the cafe after everyone's left and Rick's drinking himself into a stupor.
Then you have that kind of chiaroscuro lighting. Yeah, but
exactly.
Bergman's face is always that, kind of
they do that
gauzy.
They do that Hollywood soft focus thing on her as well. But
high key lighting. Yeah.
Actually, I was just going to bring that up. So basically, all of Rick's sort of menagerie at his place. The thing I loved about it, and I don't know necessarily any of the actors' names. I've seen them in other things. I loved that they were genuinely European or not Americans doing accents. They were genuinely, and that was another thing that I thought was really interesting about this. There's so many people who almost certainly escaped the Nazis themselves in this film.
I think maybe some of the people you're thinking of, Sidney Greenstreet, who plays the guy who owns the Blue Parrot Ferrari, was a well-known character actor for Warner's at the time, and he was in a number of these films with Bogart, probably most famously The Maltese Falcon, where he plays the bad guy. And Peter Lorre, who plays Ugatti, is also a veteran from The Maltese Falcon. And he goes back to German cinema. I think his most famous role is M, Fritz Lang's M. But then he moves to Hollywood and isn't so much a star, but a character actor. And he takes these very memorable bit parts in movies like this and, like I said, Maltese Falcon. Those are probably the roles that people know him best for. But, I think one of the things that's so interesting about these character actors is not only are they familiar from these films, but they're familiar from parodies. You know, we see people always doing the, you know, whether it's a Looney Tunes cartoon or whatever, people doing parodies of Peter Lorre.
Yeah, I was just telling someone when we were talking about doing this intro, Jason and I tried out my Bogart impression. Not good. You're lucky I didn't. But Peter Lorre is so easy. Like anyone can do a Peter Lorre.
Yeah.
You despise me, don't you, Rick?
That's really good.
I mean, anyone can do a Peter Lorre.
Yeah, it's like an Igor.
Yeah, exactly.
To an extent.
Yeah, exactly.
Although Dooley Wilson. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with his career, honestly, and he's an interesting character because he's given more screen time, perhaps, than other African. I'm talking about, you know, Sam. Given more screen time than other African American characters perhaps would have had at this time, where, you know, he's seen as Bogart's friend. He's not just somebody that the camera passes over.
He gets profits from
luggage.
the thing. He's a partner.
Sure.
In the cafe. He's not just.
And an essential member, you know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, looking at it from a more progressive perspective, it's also problematic as well because he's still the sort of subservient kind of slightly comical sidekick to Bogart's kind of hyper-masculine male hero. One thing that's interesting about that, and I guess sort of about the character actors in Bogart, is how archetypal this film is. And I think that also accounts for its appeal and its nostalgia, is you see these people playing the same sorts of characters in other movies, not so much playing characters, but playing types. Bogart is always playing some version of Bogart. And I think last time I was on the show, we talked about Breathless and the bogey cult of the 60s and 70s, and how French critics and French filmmakers were obsessed with Bogart as this image of anti-fascist American freedom and hypermasculinity. And, you know, if you've seen Breathless, you remember Belmondo always doing this, imitating Bogart. And so he's always playing a type. And I guess that's kind of why I like actors from that period, is I'm more interested in types than quote-unquote well-developed characters. And there's an Italian philosopher, Umberto Eco. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with him, but he wrote a famous essay on Casablanca, and it's an older essay. I believe it was published in the 80s, and he suggests that one of the reasons the film has become a classic is because it's an accumulation of cliches. And a movie with some cliches we consider a bad movie. It's like a failed movie. A movie that is endless with its cliches becomes sublime. And that these cliches and these archetypes, they create this sense of deja vu. When we see them referenced in other movies, we remember Casablanca. We want to go back to Casablanca. So there's something kind of comforting about that as well.
Well, yeah, I just heard someone say the Italian, definitely. The guy who's sort of like always over the top. He always has, he won't, you know, and then he gets caught up with the French guy who's sort of, you know, those are the two sort of stereotypes.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the line where, you know, it's like, well, we already, you know, had the American assistance in the first war. So
exactly.
They definitely mentioned that. So that's a good point.
But we also have the street thief, who's, you know, he I mean, that's classic Hollywood. He could have been in any movie, you know. And he does the same thing over and over. And even when he goes by another one of the cliche characters, who, again, is a cliche because that same actor was in like 20 different movies.
Always playing these befuddled rich guys.
Yeah. And, you know, he bumps into the waiter, and the waiter's like, you know, checking himself because he knows that guy. And, you know, but I've never thought about that before. But that almost, that really rings true to me.
And so it almost becomes self-conscious, even though I don't think the film was meant to be self-conscious. It was meant to be, you know, a Hollywood movie that didn't get you to question that you were watching a Hollywood movie. It's not, the editing is invisible. It doesn't call attention to itself. The performances don't call attention to themselves. But because this movie has entered our popular lexicon, because it's endlessly quotable and easy and kind of ripe for parody, there's something about it that, you know, you are totally aware that you're watching a movie when you're watching Casablanca, and a very early 40s movie, that it becomes self-conscious even if it's not meant to be.
Was the digital restoration done here?
No. I'm sure it was Warner Brothers that put that together, but it looked great, right?
Yeah.
And you definitely notice that with the stock footage of the war.
Oh, yeah,
like that's the big difference, whereas normally you wouldn't be able to tell. But yeah, during that, you definitely tell.
Rapid fire dialogue.
Yeah. And I think Bogart, you know, Bogart's character kind of relies on that. It's not just the script. It's actually part of who he is, that he needs to be that funny, you know?
Almost like a defense.
Yeah. But let's talk about Rick's arc, because I noticed some more about that this time. I had always thought it was jilted lover is angry and then sees her again and then feels like he should be nice to her again. It's so much deeper than that. And this was the first time I picked up on a lot of it. So we learned that when Rick and Elsa are in Paris, we learned that he is wanted, or they expect that he'll be wanted by the Germans. So he's running, and he wants to take Elsa with him. And she leaves, so he's mad. But then when he finds out about Laszlo, it actually gets worse for him, because he finds out that she has been with another guy who's been running, and she does go with him. She doesn't go with Rick. She picks the other guy, and she keeps picking the other guy. And that was the part of it that really got me, that I never picked up on before, that he's not just mad because she didn't go with him. He's mad because he feels like, you know, she was with me, and I'm basically the same guy.
Yeah, but cooler.
Yeah.
I own a bar.
Yeah, exactly.
At least I kiss her on the lips.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true.
I noticed that this time, too.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by Laszlo's scar.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting detail. I like it because it's never explained. We know he's in a concentration camp, and so there are just these narratives that you kind of invent for yourself as to where he got that. But it is this kind of signifier of he's seen, you know, he's seen the dark side.
Yeah, and we never find out exactly why he's sort of in trouble or, you know, not allowed to go back to America. There's, you know, we learn that he ran guns in Ethiopia, and he fought against the fascists in Spain.
And apparently he can tell exactly how far planes are, you know, and bombs and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
that's
and
impressive.
that's another little thing that I think gives a little more of his backstory. He's been in a war. You know, he knows what type of gun that is, because he's heard that gun, and he's been that far away from that gun before when it was coming towards him. And you know, we never find out more about Louis, about Claude Rains' character. We hear that he fought for France in the war, so he's in a weird way sort of on the wrong side of this again. So there's a lot of characters that we don't learn as much about, and that's, I think, one of the strengths of the film. And
also kind of what makes them archetypal is there isn't a lot of traditional character development in the way that we would understand that in, say, a Meryl Streep movie today that's competing for the Oscars.
Exactly.
I think what's interesting about Bogart's arc is, in terms of the politics of the movie, what we understand liberal to mean changes over time. And even though a progressive reading of the film would suggest that there is something that affirms a kind of conservative, patriarchal, but also patriotic rhetoric in the film, where Bogart is the kind of strong male, white, straight male hero that is affirmed, who basically learns to become a man by the end of the movie. Psychoanalytic critics would say that it's all about him learning how to become a man. But it's also, you know, Bogart's a liberal. You know, he's always, you know, fighting for the underdog.
Yeah.
He's anti-fascist. And so there is these kind of competing sets of politics in the film, and in some ways it's kind of politically incoherent in its own weird sort of way.
Yeah. It's also sort of secretly dark as well. There's that subplot with the couple.
Right.
And we see them 3 or 4 times before we find out that they're actually, you know, important to the story.
Right. The Bulgarian couple.
Yes. And the woman comes to Rick and she says, she basically says that you know, Claude Rains' character has said he'll sleep with her and give her, and
which they never say out loud.
Exactly, exactly, in a very old Hollywood sort of way. But that's there, and that's sort of the turning point for Rick. But that's this whole other subplot that they could have had their own movie coming up to this point. That could have been the last scene in their movie. That could have been the music swelling, and then they get on the plane, and then their movie's over.
That's cool. I like that reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Casablanca prequel.
Exactly.
They can do it.
Exactly.
They can do it.
Another note: if this movie came out today, how quickly would they have greenlighted a sequel? Rick, and what would it have included? Rick going around,
it would have been a buddy comedy.
Yeah,
him and Louis just, you know, palling around. Yeah, I think right away, and I think in some ways some of these imitations almost are like sequels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm glad there's never been a remake of it personally, but
There's a TV adaptation in the 50s, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I've read some articles about Casablanca, and different people at different times have said things like, "Oh, well, wouldn't it just be great if there was a Casablanca 2?" You know, and I'm sure if Ted Turner had gotten his way and gotten to colorize all those movies, this would have been, you know, right up there for him to colorize. I'm very glad it never came to that. In fact, is there a colorized version of this somewhere?
No.
Sorry?
Did you?
It has been colorized.
Interesting. I didn't think I thought that was like the line in the sand.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. How could it?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, any final thoughts? I think we're gonna get out of here.
No, the only thing I was going to add was when you mentioned about how they kind of dance around Louis wanting to sleep with the young woman. The Breen office was very touchy about any impropriety or the suggestion of impropriety in this film, as they always were. And there should be no implication that Bogart and Bergman had sex after they reunited in Casablanca because she's a married woman.
Exactly.
And so the writers, the Epstein brothers, thought, well, you know, let's just kind of let the audience make up their mind and decide whether or not they actually did whatever in the you know, upstairs of the bar. But there is that moment when they kind of kiss on the lips and they fade out and fade back in on the phallic tower outside as he's smoking the cigarette, and we can kind of assume what, you know.
Well, because I seem to recall, I remember reading about the play. She did explicitly have sex with him, but I think it works better if I like to believe that they didn't, but maybe they did.
And if they've made it now, they would have.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anything?
I'm just glad to be here at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get out of here. Thank you guys so much for sticking around. We'll get out of here. Will, thank you for sitting down with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So I'm Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.